back into World War I. Now, we ended on a cliffhanger because we talked about bad feet stuff. So, we will finish that. Hey! Okay. All right, so let's remind ourselves a quick review. Listen, let's remind ourselves of a really quick review about what we're talking about here. So if you guys remember, a single invention completely changes the tide of warfare even up until today. What is that invention? The technically the belt-fed machine gun, but it is the machine gun, and they will work either way with that, even if you just say machine gun, but technically it is the belt-fed. And as you guys know, the belt-fed machine gun directly leads to the creation of what warfare tactic? French warfare. Good, see, we're good. We're getting there. So basically, we talked about all that before. And we talked about how this ends up creating the trenches, and we talked about how the trenches end up becoming these massive tunnel systems and different things like that. And then we talked about the muck, and this is the cliffhanger that we left you guys on. So let's remind ourselves about the muck. So basically what happens is there's all of this destruction. There's artillery shells, there's mortar shells, all these different things going on. And it creates this massive icky factor in all these trenches. And so we talked about the creation of trench warfare, okay? So, or not trench warfare, trench foot. So I want you guys to remember of a time that in your life you have stepped in a puddle, okay? And you have had to wear those wet shoes, those wet socks for like the whole day. What does your foot look like when that happens and you take off all your shoes? A raisin. Now again, if you have a foot phobia, today is not for you. Look away. I have had roommates that have foot phobias, and I totally get it, because I had a roommate in college that had a foot phobia and is extremely severe. So if it's you, just if you have a foot thing, just look away, okay? So as you guys remember, this is what your foot looks like, okay? Oh my gosh. If you think this is bad, it's about to get 1,000 times worse, okay? Now, this, listen, is considered minor trench foot, okay? And when we talk about minor trench foot, this is extremely, extremely minor. So don't be going around being to your parents, I have trench foot, okay? Don't be annoying. So, this though, I don't know what you do in your spare times. So basically what happens with the original start of trench foot is when it is confined and your foot gets really hot as you walk and different things like that, the combined of the moisture as well as the heat in your foot basically causes your pores to open up. It's the reason why, and some of you might know this if you're like a beauty person, is that when you take a shower, part of the reason why showers help you with your pores is because it opens everything up. That's a fun fact. So basically what happens is your foot pores open up, but because there's so much moisture in there, it basically gets it all up in a sponge. So your foot becomes a giant sponge, and then eventually over time, over the next couple of hours, your foot gradually, basically the water becomes vapor. I'm sorry, there's sciencey words for it, and I can't remember what it. Gas. Evaporating. That's it.
It's like sitting in a hot tub for a long time.
Well, if you sit in a hot tub for a long time, it'll be just like this. That's why you get so wrinkly, is because the heat of it. That's why, I don't know if you guys know this, but you're not supposed to be in a hot tub for more than 15 minutes. It's because, yeah, have you guys never seen those warnings? Yeah. So there's actually a warning. Next time you enter a public hot tub, there's a warning on there that says do not stay in for more than 15 minutes because your body begins to get it in, and basically all the chemicals will enter your body, and it can actually be really sick. It's part of the reason why you're not supposed to be in there more. So what happens with trench foot, though, is once your foot becomes like this and all its pores are open, all these men are sitting hours and hours and hours at a time in this water. And by the way, the average person removed their boots and their socks every 8 months. So your foot does not leave it, partially because you don't want to see what's inside. And also, if you take off your shoe, what are you going to do? Put it in mud? There's no little place that you can be able to go. It's kind of like when you go camping and how you tend to leave like a lot of the same stuff on. It's because it's really messy and dirty. And so people will leave it on for a long time, and basically all of that moisture begins to make disease and things like that, and you eventually get trench foot. Now, I want to warn you, if you thought this picture was bad, it's about to get worse. So I'm just letting you know. Warning, warning, warning. Okay? So what happens is basically your foot literally dies off because it has so much moisture. It's unable to basically get the capillaries and not able to bring blood to your foot correctly. And so it breeds all this disease and your foot literally dies. Now the problem is, as a person, you don't actually realize it is happening. It is a slow, month-over-month kind of a thing, and you just stop losing feeling in your feet. Now it gets so dead, and what you're seeing in the top right is that it gets so dead that by the point that it's at this, you can literally grab a toe and snap it off like a cracker. That's how dead all of that skin and that bone is inside of it. Now, this is what would be considered mild trench foot. So the last one is severe trench foot. This is mild trench foot, where basically the skin around it is so dead, and then how they treat you is they cut with a scalpel the skin off, and they gradually pull it off of you. And the hope is that you survive the shock, because 50% of people die of shock while they're doing this. And if you know anything about skin, so if you've ever been burned or you've ever received a cut, that skin is like 10 layers deep, and it's exposed for the next 3 to 4 months until it can be able to regrow. And basically, it feels like stinging 24 hours of the day, because it's all this exposed skin that's not supposed to be there. And so what happens basically with this trench foot is it becomes really bad. And here's the other problem too. You see, there was a lot of rats that ended up coming up in this trench. You might say, well, why would the rats be there? Well, your boots are not very thick. And you have a lot of dead skin. And that's meat for those rats. So the rats would breed, bite through the boots as people were sleeping, and then eat away at your foot. But your foot is so dead that you can't feel it. So some people would like find holes, take off their boot and find like a toe missing, because the rats have eaten it so much. Which is why they invented what is called the rat terrier in World War I, where they bred the rat terrier, which is the one that's in the left, that's a little dog there. And a rat terrier would typically kill between 600 and 700 rats per day in the trenches, because the rats bred so much. It's part of the reason why if you have a rat terrier, they actually have agility competitions where all they do is do techniques of being able to find rats. It's actually really interesting. It used to be on ESPN, but I haven't seen it in about 15 years, so I guess people didn't watch the rat terrier competitions. But it used to be really, really cool to be able to watch. Now, the other problem with trench war, or the other major weapon of war, so there's really 3 major weapons of war that you need to know about for this war. One is the belt-fed machine gun. That's the most commonly asked about. And number 2 is the start of chemical warfare. So Germany begins chemical warfare, where basically as soon as it comes into contact with any sort of air, that's when it releases. Now, when we talk about the types of chemical warfare, there are 4 major types that you can be able to use. Now, one of these we still use today, which is tear gas. So tear gas, which is not a fatal gas. It is typically used to be able to stop somebody. Nowadays, you guys can have pepper spray. Pepper spray is about 30% pepper. Bear spray is 70% pepper, which is why you can't use that on somebody. So I hear some people say, well, I'm just going to carry bear mace to protect myself, because that's worse. If you use bear mace on somebody, it's actually, you could be charged with something because it's such a severe amount of pepper. That's why it's only supposed to be used in for bears. That's why it's called bear mace. Okay? But tear gas basically is able to break that up. Here are the ones that you care about, is the chlorine gas, the phosphine gas, and the mustard gas. So let's start with mustard gas. Mustard gas, hey, only 2 to 3% fatality rate. Problem is, you're going to want to die after you have it inhaled. So basically what mustard gas does is when you inhale it, it creates a whole bunch of little pus pockets inside of your throat as well as your lungs. So imagine, so you guys know how I was coughing for the last couple of weeks because I had bronchitis and stuff? That's because that's an illness that basically coats pus around the outside of your lungs and makes it hard to breathe. Now imagine if your lung capacity went down to about 20% because you have little pus pockets from the mustard gas. Oh, and by the way, after they're there, they scar and they never go away, which means for the rest of your life, you are wheezing and unable to breathe and constantly coughing for the rest of your life. So yeah, you'll survive, but you won't be able to breathe. It'll feel like you're suffocating every second of the day. How about we go into the phosphine gas and the chlorine gas? So we'll start with the chlorine gas, which was somewhat less used, partially because of the massive expense of using chlorine gas compared to the phosphine gas. What happens with chlorine gas is basically you inhale it and your lungs begin to massively expand, and then eventually they will burst. And that's what happens with the chlorine gas. But it was extremely expensive, so we only know about 5,000 known fatalities from chlorine. Phosgene gas is the most commonly used and has an 85% fatality rate. So here's what I want you to imagine. I want you to imagine you are a soldier for the French army. You are walking along on a windy day, which they used this as a windy day because they needed the wind to be able to take the gas. All of a sudden, you are filled all around you with all of this gas, but you're not going to die just yet. About 3 minutes later, your body begins basically to be able to condense all of that gas into your lungs. And imagine a balloon and slowly squeezing that balloon until eventually you get to the very end of that balloon where none of the gas exists and your lungs no longer expand. So you literally have your lungs shrink to the point where it can no longer breathe and you suffocate to death. Now, when you get into World War II and you're talking about the Holocaust, chlorine gas ends up being combined with phosgene gas, and the gas that ends up being used in the Holocaust is ones that burst the lungs, which is the most common ones. They are able to find a little bit better of an economical use when they get into the war. Chemical warfare, is it legal today? No, according to the Geneva Convention, you cannot use chemical gases, nerve agents, anything like that on your people or on another one is against the rules of war. Which is why if you know anything about Syria and what's been going on with Syria in the last 8 years of their use of chemical weaponry, it is technically against the rules of warfare to use chemical gases. Just so that you are aware. So basically what happens is, again, lots of massive amounts of death that's coming from this time period. Now, interesting fact, though, we started to have gas masks to be able to combat this. I want you to think in your head if you have a grandparent that loves prunes. Okay, just think about that for a second. Now, you might say, who the heck eats prunes? My son actually really likes prunes, so somebody likes prunes. But the reason why your grandparents liked prunes is because they discovered in World War I that crushed up prunes could block the chemical weapons coming through a gas mask. And so what they would do is all these prune producers produced all these prunes for the war effort to be able to create in the gas masks. And then once the war was over, they didn't have a need for it anymore, so people started to cook with it. And that's why a lot of your grandparents or great-grandparents born in the 30s and the 40s eat prunes is because of World War I. So there's a little factoid next time you go to eat some prunes. And then this is not going to be on the AP exam, but it's one of my favorite weapons to show you, which is the invention of the flamethrower. So the flamethrower was originally created in World War I as a means to be able to stop the trenches. So basically what they would do is first, that's part of the way that they were able to clear no man's land, is basically destroy it all by burning it down. And then also, if you were one of the special elite teams, you would actually go into the trenches, you would start it on fire, burn everything to the ground as well as the people inside of it, in an attempt to be able to destroy your other person. Now, you might say to yourself, so what would happen if there was a flamethrower near me? It's a good thing I have a video to show you what would happen. So, this is a video from a British series where they basically take weapons of war and they recreate them. So they will use the exact specifications, the exact combination. And so what this video is going to show you is when they combine diesel. So they start to mix diesel fuel, and then this is what's going to come at you. So I want you to imagine you're a soldier in the war. The German army creates this, and the Germans are going to come after you with something that looks like this.
In 1916, Livins added diesel to his fuel mix.
The diesel's in there to give it extra thickness and carry, and also to make sure it stays alight when it reaches the German trenches. So some of it's alight as it's going over there, it lands in the trenches, and then it catches fire, so whoever's in the trenches.
If they succeed in igniting this mixture of diesel and kerosene, the effect will be as close to the original weapon as we can possibly get.
Okay, Mark, you good to go when you are?
So imagine that coming at you as a soldier, okay? So you can see the massive amount. So a lot of this weaponry, too, were fear tactics, right? Of people wanting to desert when they see something like this. Now, I want to point out something else about World War I. Who are these guys? They're the stormtroopers from what movie series? Star Wars. I heard one Star Trek, but it is Star Wars. Okay. So I want to point something out about this. Now, first off, in the movies, what do stormtroopers? There's always a running joke. What can't they do? Have you guys ever heard the joke? They can't shoot. They can't ever hit their shots. Well, here's something you might not have known. When Star Wars was first created in the 1970s, and we see this in trends in pop culture, they used German references in the movies. So, for example, okay, hold on. Dang it, it's not working. Hold on, something happened. I don't know what's happening, but it's not happening good. Okay, so when you think, for example, of Darth Vader, Darth is actually more of an Austrian word for dark, and then Vader is actually, Vater is V-A-T-E-R, is father in German. And so basically dark father, which, spoiler alert, you would, if you watch the movies, you would know what that means. So basically, though, there's something really interesting about these movies. Now, I want you to look at Darth Vader. Look at him closely. Stare at him as I switch to the next picture. Compare that to the stormtroopers in World War I. Do you guys see their hats? See how they're similar? Yeah. That's because there's a reason for this. In World War I, the front lines, what we would consider the Marines of the United States for Germany, were called stormtroopers. So again, what can't stormtroopers do? So what does that mean Germans can't do in World War I? Shoot. So it's a running joke. So actually throughout the movie, you can Google it online. There are entire guides about all of the sly ways that they made fun of the Nazis, or not the Nazis, excuse me, World War I, as well as the Nazis in World War II. And you can see it all throughout the original trilogy in the Star Wars films. And you can see that today. So like you'll notice too, in the 70s and the 80s, all the villains are Russian. It's because we hated the Russians during the time. I would love to teach a pop culture class, but anyways, I digress. That brings us to everybody's favorite holiday for like maybe some of you. What holiday are we going to talk about? It is not Halloween, but you were really close, huh, Hudson? Yeah. Okay. So we are going to talk about Christmas because one of my favorite events in the entire history of all of the wars happens at Christmas time. And basically what happens is one of the biggest events of really showing people coming together at war is going to happen. Now, instead of telling you about it, I'm going to show you a video. Now, this video is from a couple years ago in England. It is trying to sell you something. It is a commercial. It was rated the top commercial in the world in 2015 when it premiered. So it is a very popular commercial. It has about 100 million views, so if you've seen it already, sorry, but you probably haven't. But I want to teach you about something that happened in the Battle of the Prix. The Battle of the Prix, Y-P-R-E-S.
Nine. name is Jim.
Mein Name ist Otto.
Pleased to meet you, Otto.
Freut mich.
Those, she's called.
Schön. Schön.
Happy Christmas.
Frohe Weihnachten.
And now everybody wants to go buy some chocolate, right?
That actually happened.
So the event that is shown in this video is a real event, and it's called the Christmas Tree Truce. So it's very similar to how it happened in there. The kind of beginning thing with Silent Night is not necessarily what happened, but basically, really, this was at the start of the war. It's the first major world war. Nobody really knew what is the protocol for a holiday, especially a religious holiday that's so important to both countries. And so basically what they did is they just had a 3-day truce. So this was in a single section of about 50 miles on the front lines, where they sang Christmas carols, just like in the show. They play... why is this just having struggles? That's what happens when I put videos in the PowerPoints. So they played soccer and different things like that. Now, unfortunately, though, this doesn't have the happy ending as it shows in the video. When the things resumed, the German government found out what they had done. They ended up actually executing all of the generals that had approved this, as well as basically court-martialing and imprisoning the vast majority of people who participated in the activities. But it does kind of show, like, this is another change of warfare, right? So you start with this idea of, okay, well, we're going to have a truce on a day that's so important, similar to how people had truces in the past when holidays came around, but that's no longer anymore, right? You don't just stop warfare for it. So it's really sad. In terms of the actual commercial, the commercial was extremely successful, and the company sold over $10 million more chocolate that year than any other year previously. So go buy some chocolate, maybe for Miss Ray, and celebrate the Christmas tree truce. Yeah. Wait, what? I do not accept bribes legally. You can buy chocolate for me, and I just don't have to give you anything in return except
Oh
a
my
smile.
gosh, that's what I'm going to do for this.
Yeah.
I get you chocolate.
There you go. Yeah.
Just got my memo.
So after this treaty, the soldiers refused to fight. Is that why the generals were executed?
Yeah, the generals were executed because it was basically, they said that, it wasn't that they signed a treaty, it's just that they agreed to stop, and they basically said, you should never stop fighting. Like, your responsibility is to fight, and it's not, these are the enemy, not your friends.
Josh, just draw a chocolate bar over.
Oh my gosh, no, we're not drawing anything more on that blanket. Okay, now let's head into America going into the war. Now, these 6, if you want to bracket these and put causation essay. So, again, we talked about this before with World War I. There are 2 major topics that you will probably see on the AP exam. One is a causation essay on the causes and effects of the war, and the second is a CCOT essay that is on the stuff that we're going to talk about in just a second. There are 2 papers there that you can grab both of them. So all of these, if you will star these, are must know. You need to know what directly led to America entering into the war. So initially, America declares complete neutrality, which basically says it's not that we're isolationists. We're going to still trade with you, but we have nothing to do with this war. This is all happening in Europe. It has nothing to do with us. Now, Woodrow Wilson, who's the president at the time, by the way, I would highlight Woodrow Wilson. You need to make sure you know 99% of the time, if you see Woodrow Wilson on the AP exam, it is exclusively World War I. Does anybody remember what the other thing is that it might be? There's 2 of them. The NAACP, trust busting with the Clayton Antitrust Act, and there's one more. He created an organization in the economy to combat FTC. Okay? Those are the most common things you'll see with Wilson. So Woodrow Wilson basically goes into this war with complete neutrality. In fact, he wins his second election with the phrase, "We will not go to war. I will keep you out of war." That's how he wins. And then the Lusitania happens. Now, the Lusitania, if you will star this event, yeah, it's called like Dead Wake or something like that. Is a really famous one.
No, it wasn't interesting. It was fiction, but it was based like.
Yeah, you're right. So basically, the Lusitania becomes the major thing. Now, you would need to make sure you know for Lusitania the word U-boat, which I think is on there, yes? Yeah. Yes, okay. And U-boat is why the connect the dots is the way it is. So a U-boat is a German submarine, and you need to make sure you know that. I like to think of it as underwater boat. That's what I think of when I think of U-boat, okay? Now, the German submarines were extremely successful, and basically they created a massive blockade around England. And so this blockade was around England, which prevented England from being able to get supplies during this time. Now remember, America is 100% neutral, okay? All we are doing is having a ship go back and forth, and that ship is the Lusitania. Now the Lusitania was basically a Titanic. So think of it in your head as a Titanic. It is a passenger line ship with first, second, and third class. It is going specifically to Ireland. Over 50% of the people on the ship are American citizens. So basically what happens is as the Lusitania comes upon Ireland, it is an extremely foggy morning. So foggy that the captains could not see the shoreline, nor could it see the lighthouses. So it had basically no bearing or knowing where it was in England. So basically what happens is they receive a telegram from England that says there are U-boats in the waters, be careful. So in order to be able to avoid disaster, because they can't go to the shore or else they're going to hit some rocks, so they go along what they believe is the shore, but they increase their knots to basically go to cruising speed. So their goal is they're just going to keep going around Ireland until the U-boat issue is either solved or it's safe enough to be able to dock at a port. Well, that actually ended up being part of their failure. Because they increased their speed, a German U-boat 100 miles away was able to clock them at the exact speed that was perfect for shooting off a torpedo. So basically, the increasing of the speed made it perfect to shoot a torpedo out. So the Germans shoot a torpedo out at 100 miles away, and it hits the Lusitania. The Lusitania, again, this is right after the Titanic, but most things hadn't changed. There weren't enough lifeboats. There were people that were down in the bottom of the ship that were basically told, don't leave. It's safest to stay in your ship. And in the result, 1,400 people end up dying, almost 3/4 of the ship. And the Titanic, I think, was around 1,000, so there was definitely a lot more. The Titanic more becomes known because it exposes a lot of the robber baron issues of not enough lifeboats, not a safety protocol, different things like that. And the worst thing about the Lusitania as well, not just this, it was so close to the shore that people could watch it burn. So all these people watched these people dying on the shore, but because the U-boats were out there, no rescue ships were sent for over 3 hours, and all these people ended up perishing. And the Lusitania basically becomes a call of like, this is Pearl Harbor, but at this time. Now, the reason Americans are concerned is now Americans have died, right? So now all of a sudden it's not neutrality. Now Americans have died, and what should we do about it? Except if you're a conspiracy theorist person, I got a confirmed conspiracy for you. You see, remember how I said America was neutral? And America was not going to be any part of the war? That wasn't necessarily true. You see, the Lusitania had a secret. It was a passenger line, and the American government, a lot of these passenger lines, including the Titanic, it was cheaper to ship things on boats. So America was shipping, like the box basically said, like food, pencils, different things like that. The actual boxes in the Lusitania had bombs and weapons and ammunition. So basically, it was using secret passenger lines to transport goods back and forth to England under the guise of this. So imagine if you're like on your Disney cruise, and you're cruising along, and it turns out you got like 7 nukes underneath you that are being secretly transported back and forth. That's basically what happened. Now, that does not come out, that information, until after the war, but the Germans knew it. So what was the real reason that the Germans bombed it? Is because this ship had goods and ammunitions for England. So basically, the Lusitania has now sunk, and we now begin to push and move in further and further into the war. But that brings us to really the big event, because even though all of that was happening, we still said we're going to remain neutral until this telegram is received. And that is the Zimmerman note, or the Zimmerman telegram, and you need to star that. That is the, if you want to write next to this is the trigger movement for why we go into war. And the Zimmerman note is, first off, crazy to think about. This guy is like a telegram operator in England. He's like for some news reporting station. He's just chilling on the telegram, and people are telegramming back and forth about the war, big deal. And all of a sudden he hears this telegram. And it was an accidentally unencrypted telegram sent from Germany to Mexico. You might say, whoa. We haven't even talked about Mexico. First off, you need to know it was Germany to Mexico. And I would circle Mexico because you got to remember it was Mexico. And he intercepts this telegram, and he goes and tells his bosses, and they're like, oh, that is just some kids playing around. That's not real. And they ignore him. So what does the telegram operator do? He sells the telegram to the New York Times, who publishes it in the newspaper. And here is basically what the telegram says. The telegram tells Mexico, if you invade into the United States, we will, when we win the war, give you 100% of the land back that you lost in the Mexican cession following the Mexican-American War. So basically, you will get back a third of the United States if we win the war by you invading Mexico. So imagine if today we're all chilling, no big deal, and all of a sudden we find out that there are 25 nuclear bombs in Canada on the border waiting to attack us. That's what the fear was. And all of a sudden, reconnaissance planes going over Mexico finds massive amounts of ammunition, army, tanks, everything ready to go. All of a sudden, we are on the brink of war, and we had no idea. Now, the Zimmerman note is what takes us directly into war, because even though Wilson had just barely been reelected on the platform of not taking us into war, this is what changes it. And so basically what happens is, so if you look at all of this, so America declares neutrality, the Lusitania occurs, May of 1916 is the preparedness program. Basically, we are preparing in case we need to go to war, but we won't go to war. Wilson wins re-election under the slogan, he kept us out of war, and then the Zimmerman note occurs, and that directly leads us into the war. And now America's going to declare war. Now, you need to know for World War I that America is going to be in a period of total warfare. So if you will circle total warfare, and total warfare is basically when 100% of the war effort and American population is directed towards the war. So right now, when we fight in other countries, are we in total warfare right now? No. We live our lives like it's no big deal. You guys go, and you guys go eat your Cafe Rio, and you go watch your TV shows, and you just don't even think about the war that's going on. Even though we're not in a war, we're still battling. I would say the most similar to total warfare was immediately after 9/11. But it didn't last very long. And really, a lot of us have gone back just to how it was before. At this point, though, it is 100% of the warfare, which I will show you. One other thing I want to point out, too, is the war of attrition. And this is going to be especially used by Germany. So America switches to total warfare. Germany switches towards the war of attrition, which is basically the idea of 100% killing as many people as possible in order to wear down the effort. So that's why they have the flamethrowers. That's why they use the belt-fed machine gun. Anything to wear it down, which is why it was called Bleed France White, was basically we're going to kill so many people in France that France will surrender, which it did eventually do. So let's talk about how America goes into the war. Now, the home front of World War I would bracket this, star this, and you could put next to this CCOT essay. There are, again, two major essays. Causation, for cause and effects of the war, and the home front has been an essay almost every 5 to 7 years. There is some sort of an essay on World War I specifically about the home front. This is the most likely essay that you're going to receive on the AP exam. Okay? So we're going to go through basically, and by the way, this is 4 key concepts all about the home front, which is why we know it's so important. So let's talk about basically what you need to know. So we're going to go through a whole bunch of these examples. So on the exam, these would be your categories. Evaluate the extent to which World War I showed a change in the American home front or the movement towards total warfare. One example of total warfare was the poster war. One example of the switch to total warfare was required selective service in the draft, whatever it could possibly be. These are a ton of categories. pick some that you're really passionate about, and I will tell you in particular the ones I would know the most. So let's start with the poster war. Now, poster war is basically where you have these massive campaigns using propaganda for poster. So you can see on the left, you can see the Scheuer's Mad Brute. We know that this is the German army because of the hats, which was the traditional German army hat. The world cannot live half slave and half free. All of these are trying to convince you to support the war. Now, the next thing is what is called a war bond, and we don't have these today because we go into debt. So remember how we talked about how they're on the gold standard? You can only spend the amount of money that you had in the bank. So how are you going to fund a war when you don't have enough money in the bank? Well, what they encourage people to do, and this was starting in the Civil War, World War I had it, and World War II, and then we stopped the practice of it because now we can go into debt. So you would buy what's called a war bond or a liberty bond. And basically what you would do is you would loan the government money. So you would go to the post office and you would buy a stamp. But the stamp would be $5, $10, whatever it could possibly be. Then that money goes to the government. They use your money with the idea that after the war, they will pay you back with like 5% interest. So you, as an American citizen, are loaning them. Think of it as a GoFundMe for the American government, who will then pay you back after the war. That's basically what it is. And war bonds were extremely popular. A lot of people spent it because it was an easy way to be able to support the war effort through your money. Now, additionally, is the selective service, which is the draft. Okay, so make sure you put next to selective service is the draft. We did have a draft in World War I. It's much more expansive in World War II, and then becomes controversial in Vietnam. Now, we've talked about the draft before, so I'm not going to go into it a lot, but if you will highlight selective service, that is a term that's used in the First and Second World Wars on the AP exam. That is the act that requires you to sign up. So a lot of times when you get your draft card to sign up, it'll say, congratulations, you get to sign up for selective service. That is the draft, okay? And as we talked about before, if you are male, don't forget to sign up for the draft so that you can be able to get your FAFSA to go to college. Because if you don't sign up for the draft, they will reject your FAFSA. So, when you are, So what are the requirements to receive any federal funding, including Medicaid, Medicare, food stamps, anything like that, is you have to be signed up for the draft, and that includes FAFSA. So what happens is, so the FAFSA deadline, I don't know if you guys know this, but it's March 1st, which is why everybody's trying to get their FAFSAs in if you're a senior. So March 1st is your deadline to get priority FAFSA money. And then if you don't sign up for the draft by your 18th birthday, they'll send you a reminder card, and then they will revoke your FAFSA. So if you received grants or loans from the government through FAFSA, another thing too that people don't realize, they will also require you to pay it back. So I knew of a kid who was like very anti-government. He thought the government was like spying him on him and all these different things. And so he refused to sign up for it, but he got FAFSA Pell Grants, which paid 100% of his college because they were low income at Utah State. And he got a letter right at the start of his sophomore year that says your FAFSA has been rescinded because you didn't sign up for the draft, and he had to pay back almost $8,000 to the federal government. And that is interest money. So that means that you have to pay for it with interest, and I think they only gave him 30 days to pay it back, which obviously they have payment plans, but just sign up for the draft. It's not a huge deal. Like we talked about before, it would take a huge, massive event for them to call you up to the actual military. It is currently only males. However, if we were to switch to a Democratic president in November, there was already a bill that had been signed by Congress that said women would sign up for the draft as well. And Republicans tend to be anti-women in the draft. Democrats tend to be pro-women in the draft. So my guess would be if we switch to a Democrat, there is a possibility. But currently the Democratic frontrunner has a lot of other things to think about. That's not the draft. So if it were to happen, I would think it would be a couple years out, because if the current frontrunner remains the same, there's a lot bigger things that he'd be changing right after he comes into office. But we will see. Bernie Sanders right now is the frontrunner for the Democratic Party. Joe Biden is second, and Elizabeth Warren is a distant third. So the big day that you got to care about, though, is next Tuesday. Next Tuesday is Super Tuesday. That includes the Utah one, and there are about 15 states on Super Tuesday. Super Tuesday normally decides who the Democratic frontrunner will be and who the nomination will be. So we'll see. But I will tell you that Joe Biden said if he loses it, he will continue to run. But Super Tuesday, right now we have 8 major Democratic candidates. Super Tuesday will normally narrow it down to only 2 or 3. But right now, Bernie Sanders has won all the states so far. So, exciting time in America. Very interesting. So anyways, we will see. We don't know what's going to happen to November. November's going to be a weird month. And October. It's going to be very, very interesting. What's that? The election. So the election is in November. And if Bernie Sanders does get the nomination, it's going to be a very, very interesting election season. Because those two are so opposite. Because, like, Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, they might have been on different political sides, but Hillary Clinton was much more moderate. But this would be probably the farthest left Democratic candidate that we've had in a long time. So, be very, very interesting season. Anyways, and if you're 18, go vote. Make a difference in your government.
I'll be voting then.
Good. Good. If you are 18 years old, please. I don't think you're old enough. Are you going to be 18?
I'll order Uber Eats.
Oh, really?
And we can.
Oh, cool.
I'll order Uber Eats.
You'll order Uber Eats and then you'll come? Yeah, or make sure that you sign up for mail-in voting so you don't have to wait in the 4-hour line at the place to vote. Do mail-in voting, way easier. Okay. All right, listen. Now, another example, for instance, that you might see on the AP exam, and this is more of one to help trigger your memory, has to do with doughboys. Now, sorry. Guys, I told you it's an A day. These are my struggle days. Try to remind myself what I put on here. Doughboys is on the back. It's like the 4. I know it's out of order, sorry. Okay? But you mean doughboy. Doughboy. Okay. All right. You guys sound like the little pelicans or whatever from Finding Nemo. Okay. I apologize to the YouTube world for my student. Okay. I never said that you were my favorite class. Okay. All right. So, doughboys is actually a little bit of a sad thing, though. Okay. It's sad. Okay. So doughboys, though, are a little bit sadder than this. And the reason it's called a doughboy, and this is kind of like a weird thing, but have you guys ever heard somebody, don't call people this, but have you guys ever heard somebody call somebody doughy? Anybody ever heard that? It was a really popular insult more in like the 80s, but doughy is when you got some dough on you. You get that? You're kind of, if you think about like bread and you think about like a giant in like your tummy, okay? That's what they would call you. They'd call you doughy. Well, unfortunately, a doughboy is a person that basically is doughy because they're brand new into the war. So prior to this, a lot of people had months and months and months of training. And then unfortunately, though, I got to the point where we needed people so fast that we were only giving them sometimes up to 2 months in training. So they were called these doughboys because of the fact that they were going without a lot of training, without a lot of, like, that's where you get, like, there's not a lot of weight loss because you're not in the military for a long time. So these doughboys ended up being the highest death rates as well because they had lack of training compared to everybody else. Now, another way that you could be invested into the war is also to work for the war industry. So this was the phrase worker fight. It was actually a congressional effort to be able to get people to enlist in the war effort. So basically, it encouraged people to work really hard. So you can see on the right, God help me if this is a dud. His life is in your hands. You either work hard or you possibly might end up killing somebody with your faulty work. And you can see that even agriculturalists on the left can still work and be part of the war effort, even if they're not actually fighting into the war. Now, another thing, too, that happens with this worker fight that you can see is actually changes for total warfare. So I want to give you a really good example that shows how committed they were to the war. There is only 1 year that the World Series was not played, and that's in the year 1919. And there's a reason it was not played. Basically, what happened is first half of Major League Baseball was lost to the draft. So everything that was left was very, very few. And then people started to say, why would we go to baseball games when all of our men are dying out of war? Why would we go have fun and go enjoy things when people are suffering and dying, our brothers and our uncles and our aunts, or our uncles, things like that? And so what they started to do instead is they tried to save Major League Baseball by basically doing military drills. So what they would do is they would, before the actual thing, they would do, like you can see right here, they would do a military drill. They would sing the national anthem, God Bless America. Anything they could to be able to show that this was still American and it was not an over-exaggeration. But in the end, people stopped going. People said it was too un-American to go off and enjoy pastime. So you can see the difference between total warfare now and then is you guys still go to movies. You guys still do these type of things, even though we're in the war. But back then they said it was bad, and so they shut down Major League Baseball for 1.5 years because it was un-American to have at this time. Additionally, about 1/4 of the men in the Major League Baseball did die when they were fighting off in World War I. So a major change during that time. War rationing is one I would star. This is the most common one that you will see. Poster war is another one I would star. So rationing is basically the idea that, again, you ration your food. So to be able to send more meat off to war, eat less meat, send it off. Eat less cheese, send it off. Don't eat as much vegetables, send it off. Anything that you can be able to do to be able to help the war effort. And so a lot of people started to be able to push this, but what about women? How can women be able to fight? Well, one way was, for example, through purchasing Liberty bonds. Another way was through working as a nurse. Additionally, a lot of women started to convert into the war effort. And I think it's on here somewhere, right? Women. The back of the top page, if you will put next to women, women's suffrage. Women working in World War I was part of the major catalyst for why they request the right to vote a few years later. Basically, women started to do just as well as men, just as big of an impact as men, and they wanted the right to vote later on. So you can also put next to this women breaking, you can also put that's a good contextualization for any women's suffrage. So if you have a women's suffrage essay or a HIP analysis, you can always do World War I is a really good one in terms of going into the war effort. We talked about that before. We talked about women in the war. Okay, impact on industrial cities. One thing I would know is that first bullet. Make sure that you know basically that businesses that were unimportant, such as Major League Baseball, began to shut down. And then also the Great Migration, if you will highlight, workers begin to move to cities. And this is the rise of the city, and we will especially talk about that later with African Americans in the 1920s, which will be next class period. But people begin to move towards the cities. Okay, anti-war dissenters. One of the key concepts is specifically about why did people disagree with the war and what was going on. So basically people started to say what was the validity of the war. People started to discriminate against people, which is what we're going to more talk about now. So basically people started to protest the war. Why are we in this war? Why are we saying that this is a thing that we should do? They never technically directly attacked us yet. We're just fighting Europeans' war. And what happens is the American government begins to pass several laws that end up basically saying that you can't do this stuff and you can't be anti-American. So the first law has to do with, oh, by the way, too, a lot of fear of socialism coming on in America was also a major fear as well. So let's talk about the ones that are specifically referred to in the key concepts. And these are called the Espionage Act and the Sedition Act. So the Espionage Act of 1917 is going to say that basically if you will highlight false statements and if you also highlight mailed. So the Espionage Act said, and espionage is another word for like spying and stuff, you could be convicted as a spy if you mail anti-American things. So let me give you a really good example. So let's pretend that you don't like the war effort, okay? And a lot of this idea of like why they did this so much. So this is like an example of one thing that was shown. So this is actually an original drawing. You can see that Jesus Christ is being killed by all the different people in the war. The person who drew this took this picture and mass produced it. Then they mailed it in the mail. Now this was supposed to be an anti-war thing, and he was arrested under the Espionage Act. And basically what happened is they said, you can't mail these things in the mail. You guys remember Eugene Debs? Yeah. Socialist Party? Remember how I said that he almost won the war in jail? He was arrested because he was sending anti-American or anti-war things in the mail to people. And it violated the Espionage Act. Now, in terms of the Sedition Act, that's the one I would start because it's the most likely that you are going to see. And the Sedition Act said, if you will highlight restricting criticism. This banned any law, any statement, any typed piece, anything you wrote against the U.S. government. Yes?
Is it 19, 17, or 18? Because it says 18 on our papers, but 17 up there.
Somebody Google it real quick to double check. I think it's 17, but I might have written it wrong on your paper. I'm pretty sure it's 17. Somebody Google Sedition Act of and tell me what comes up. 1918. Okay, there you go, 1918. But if you just use the Sedition Act, then that'll be fine. So you can change it to 1918, but they're not going to dock you down for that. So basically what the Sedition Act said is you cannot say anything bad about the government. Now, if you want to put next to this, censorship. This is when the U.S. government, as well as several other nations, censored their people about anti-war or anti-British American stuff. So this started in England. England began to ban this and basically said it was for the Defense of the Realm Act, but said by the Defense of the Realm, you cannot speak poorly about your government or the war. So what would this look like? So starting in England, you would be able to write back and forth to your family. All your letters were read. So every letter that you wrote back to your family or they wrote to you was read by a censorship person. If they determined that what you said was either too much information or anti-war, they would censor your letter and you would get this in the mail. So what this is saying is basically it's being returned, and if you notice it says it's because they talked about the Zeppelin raids. The Zeppelin raids were basically air raids by giant Zeppelins, blimps, in London. So, and it doesn't necessarily mean that you talk badly about it. You could just say, hey, we've been hearing over in England that there's like these Zeppelins that are bombing things. That could be censored. If you say, for example, I think this is a bad idea, that could be censored. And you would receive this back in the mail. Or even better, in America, the Sedition Act had your stuff edited. So you would receive edited letters in the mail from your soldiers or from your family members. So if I sat there and said, man, this trench foot's really killing me, some other guy had a rat eat through his boot, you would have a letter that looked like this because they would delete anything that they saw as un-American or could possibly give away secrets to the different people. Now, this act, you might say, what amendment might that be violating? Your First Amendment right, correct? You can't do that? Well, it went to the U.S. Supreme Court in a Supreme Court case called Schenck v. U.S. Espionage and Sedition Act. And if you will star this is one of the Supreme Courts that you'll need to know. And basically what happened is it restricted the freedom of speech. Schenck mailed pamphlets to potential draftees saying, don't sign up for the draft. Now, this is the crazy part of this. The last bullet is what you need to know. In the end, the Supreme Court said, in a defense situation, they can restrict your freedom of speech. Censorship is legal in the United States. Now, is that true today? No. But here's the weird part. This law has never been taken off the books. Basically, in 1921, a statement was made by the U.S. government that said, we probably shouldn't have done this. However, there has never been a Supreme Court case that has directly repealed this, and it's never been repealed from the U.S. government. Now, you might say, well, wait a second, so am I going to start to be censored? No. Really, the major part of this act that is still used today is the Espionage Act, the most famous example of which is Assange, who is a guy that basically took a bunch of American secrets and put it, Julian Assange, he put it on WikiLeaks and exposed a bunch of things on America. If you don't know, by the way, he is actually currently waiting to be extradited to the United States. He was captured in England, he is waiting extradition, and he would be tried under this act. So this act is more used now for exposing real secrets, such as, for example, when he put all those secret documents up on the internet. And so that's where it goes. But technically it's never been repealed. But it's not going to be used against you because there's too many Supreme Court cases saying you can't do this. Now, a lot of people started to say, is this just heavily restricting people? So you can see how he's grabbing all the traitors. You can see he's holding back people who are disagreeing with him. And a couple more points really quick, literally, of what we're going to do. Now, 14 points. If you see this, if you will outline President Wilson's war aims. Basically, he came up with 14 reasons of why we should be able to have this freedom and this peace. And basically, this will be his reasoning for why we went into the war, if you see that as a sourcing. And it brings us to the end of the war. So basically, in the end, we win the war. They are not going to ask you about battles. If they ask you anything, it's about warfare techniques, such as submarine warfare or machine gun, whatever it could be. What you do need to know on a causation essay, there could be one that says, evaluate the extent to which World War II changed the United States or changed world affairs, whatever it could be. These are the 2 points that you need to know for the major effects. The first is the creation of the League of Nations. Woodrow Wilson suggests creating a League of Nations. And this league would basically be what the modern day equivalent is the United Nations. Basically an organization that comes together and polices the world. The vast majority of the world is a part of this. Guess who's not a part of this? The United States. Germany was allowed to be in it, but they were heavily monitored. Okay? So what happens is the United States doesn't join. So it's the United States idea, it's Woodrow Wilson's idea, and yet he doesn't get allowed to go there. And the reason why is because Congress denied it. Congress said, we want to be isolationist, we no longer want to be involved in world affairs, and they reject it. So even though it was Wilson's idea, it gets rejected. But there's a problem. So the major issue having to do with this League of Nations is it was weak. In fact, it had no actual power. So I want you to imagine this. And again, nobody would ever do this in this class. I want you to imagine that one of you is selling like drugs at the school. You are the massive drug dealer at the school. You are causing so many problems at Scott. Again, nobody's doing this. This is, oh my gosh, it's a make-believe scenario. Okay? Now let's pretend that basically you are a major drug addict and Mr. Bingham and Officer Ricky finds you out. They bring you to the main office and they say all the reasons why you're doing bad stuff, all the problems that you're causing, and you're feeling awful, terrible, your life is ruined. And they say, now we can't do anything about it, we can't suspend you, we can't punish you, and we can't arrest you. But if you could pretty please not do that anymore, that would be great. How likely is that going to be effective? And that's what happened with the League of Nations. The League of Nations was allowed to make issues of declaration that said you were doing something wrong, but they could not actually send any, they could send aid, but they could not send military, and they could not sanction people. They had no power. So what you need to know about the League of Nations is they had no power to do anything. Which is why when Japan invades Manchuria in the 1930s, the League of Nations said, hey, can you not do that? And they just left. And the League of Nations said, well, now we can't do anything about it. Okay? There was no power. The United Nations today, do they have that power? Yes. They fixed that after World War II. So basically, the other problem is, too, the United States was the key part of this. It was really the thing that held it together. Very similar to how the United Nations has 5 major players that are considered the main people of the United Nations. The United States was one of them. Now, if you notice in this picture, you have Uncle Sam. What is missing from the bridge of the League of Nations in this? The keystone. And what is a keystone? Does anybody know what a keystone is of a bridge or a building? It's the thing that holds it together. And if the keystone is missing, what happens to the bridge? It falls and it collapses. So what is this implying is going to happen to the League of Nations if America's not a part of it? It's going to collapse, a.k.a. World War II. Okay? And that is one of the direct causes of this. Now, the last thing that we're going to cover really quickly. Oh, and by the way, so this is actually a precursor. So if you know anything about World War II, you know the invasion of Manchuria. This is part of the reason why World War II happens. As you can see, China and Japan are going to be fighting. We'll talk about this when we get to World War II. The League of Nations say, hey, this is a problem, and nothing can be done about it. And it's part of the reason it leads us directly into the war. Now, the last thing is the Treaty of Versailles. What you need to know about the Treaty of Versailles is, again, the United States never signed it. We come up with it, we draft it, but we do not sign it and accept it. Now, the Treaty of Versailles, you need to especially star that it was a complete failure. Reasons it was a failure. Number 1, the U.S. refused to join, which means any sign of aggression could not be stopped by the world's largest military. 2, if you will highlight, Germany agrees to accept all war guilt. Even though 3 major nations were involved in the Triple Entente, only 1 resumed all war guilt. Now, because of this, their economy completely collapses. And if you will write next to the economy collapses the word reparations, which is R-E-P-A-R-A-T-I-O-N-S. Reparations are where they had to pay back all of the Allied powers, or the Allies in World War I, all of the war stuff that they lost. So the money, the goods, whatever it could be. Did they know, by the way, how much money they had to pay back? Anybody know? So it's about 23 billion German marks. Now I want to compare that until today. So I want you to think in your head the number is 16. Okay, think in your head 16. I want you to add 24 zeros behind it. That is how much money Germany had to pay back, all of them. And guess how much time they gave them? 3 months. Oh my gosh. 3 months to pay back an amount that doesn't even exist. Okay? Anybody know, by the way, they did pay it all back. Does anybody know what year they paid it back?
2 years ago.
Okay. 2015 was the last year they paid back their final reparation mark. Now, if you will highlight Germany's economy collapses, aka cause of World War II. And then finally, minor countries, such as Japan, received large amounts of colonial land, which leads them to want to gain more and more land. So this is part of the reason Japan comes into the picture. What you need to know next to Treaty of Versailles directly leads to World War II. In fact, it is its own key concept that the failure of the Treaty of Versailles directly leads to the collapse of the U.S., which directly leads to World War II. Now, that is why you get things like this. So you can see the peace treaty, the land from the slaughter. It did get completely destroyed in the Senate. They wanted us to be able to be away from it. And then this is my favorite cartoon with the Germany one. You can see it says unlimited indemnity. That's the reparations. And then basically you can see Germany is basically being led out to slaughter. Now, really quickly before we end, I want to go over your homework assignment. So first off, DBQ, due Friday. Don't forget about it. Tonight's homework assignment is only about 20 to 30 minutes long. It is very, very short to give you time to work on your DBQ. What you're going to do is basically you're going to be practicing how to do HIP analysis. Now, I've adjusted some of the wording on intended audience and purpose to help you a little bit better on how to write these. You have 4 sources at the top. All you do is you write a HIP analysis for each of them. Only 1 letter. So you're only practicing 1 letter for each one, practicing your HIP analysis as if you were writing a DBQ. Sound good? Okay. All right, so you can go ahead and get ready to go. We have like 2 minutes left in class.